Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does he prospers. The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish.
Well, I hope everybody got a chance to read this week. Mostly Job talking about his life and really his integrity and the emphasis he put on trying to walk in righteousness all of his life. And he, even in the face of all the opposition surrounding him, he would not just go, "Oh, fine, you're right." And sometimes that's the easiest thing to do, to get people off our back. Just agree with them. But he wouldn't do that. That would have violated his integrity. He would have lied if he had told them you were right. Because they weren't right. We know that from the account God gives us, that he has told us that he was a blameless man, that he was walking in righteousness. And he committed, in Job 23, 11 and 12, he said, "My foot has held fast to his steps." Notice he didn't say his own. He talked about God's steps. He says, "I have kept his way and have not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion of food." Now, I don't know, when we think at that passage, it looks like he's almost reading from our scriptures. And yet, the story of Job, by most accounts, is probably written down maybe by Moses. And that's the Jewish tradition, that Moses wrote the story down, that it had happened much earlier, when we're not aware of commandments and scriptures, and yet he had heard them. Somehow and in some way, he had heard the commandments of God, and he had kept them, and he had walked in them. And here he was in this moment of his life when everything had collapsed around him. But he wouldn't say, I blew it. I messed up. He held fast to his integrity, which he talked about a number of places in this week's reading. In fact, in the beginning of chapter 27, he said, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days." This actually really, little section impressed me as much as anything in the whole book. At the very beginning of the book, when Satan had come before God, and God had said to Satan, "Have you considered Job, a blameless and upright man?" And Satan goes, "Oh, yeah, does he do that for nothing? Oh, you put a hedge around him. You take care of him. You make him prosper." And Satan, or God tells Satan, "Well, go ahead. You can touch his things." And he took everything away from his family and his wealth. And that he didn't turn away. So then God allowed Satan to touch him physically and gave him boils over his entire body, from head to the bottom of his feet. And would you imagine for a second, if you've ever had a boil, one, how painful they can be. And he had a plurality all over his body, but on the bottom of your foot, which means you can't walk, which also means you can't sit or lay down or do anything without having a boil be pressed on. There was no way for him to get away from the pain. for whatever length of time it took. And that's why he took pottery. Just imagine the concept of broken pottery and how pain you must be in to take broken pottery and take it and just rip your skin open with it. That was the kind of pain he was in. And in spite of all of that, God was completely right about Job. A blameless and upright man, in spite of losing everything that he had prospered because he walked in righteousness with God, because he had lost everything, but he said, I won't stop. I'm not going to go, this isn't worth it. I'm going to just go do whatever feels good. I'm going to go do what makes me happy. He said, no, I'm going to continue to walk and do the right thing. Got him to that point that everything seemed like it was gone and lost, and it looked like God was his enemy. And he says that in a number of different times. It looks like God had turned against him. That's, from Job's perspective, that's what it felt like and looked like to him. But he says, I won't stop doing that which is right. God was right about Job. A man of great integrity, of great courage, of great faithfulness, who walked with God all the days of his life. Now, I want us to just stop for a moment and think, because when you read that and you read him talking about being righteous and having done the right thing, sometimes I think we might get the wrong impression that he was claiming he had never sinned. And I don't believe at all that that's what he was claiming. Because a righteous man doesn't say, I've never sinned, when you've actually sinned, right? It means that you have confessed that sin and that you have made right that sin. In his day and time, that would have meant not only confessing and praying to God, but also taking an animal from all of those animals that you owned, and taking one of them, the young one that was going to prosper you down the road, and taking it and offering it as a sacrifice. So we talk about sacrifices. Sacrifices in their time had a real cost to them. Very often you and I think, and I think in the modern age of Christianity, very often Christians think of sacrifice as that was difficult on me. But could you imagine for a second that every time you sinned and confessed it, you simply went to your bank account and took, 5% of it out and just gave it away? Because that's what they sacrificed. They sacrificed real wealth whenever they sinned. And so Job is saying that he had made it right. If he had harmed anybody, if he'd hurt anybody, he would have made that right. And so he had walked that way all of his life. And he found God. And this is where I want to kind of transition to the Psalm 1. You've been studying it. I don't know if you guys spent a lot of time with it as Rich has been teaching in here, the class on Psalms. But Psalm 1, in the first 3 verses especially, talk about this idea of the righteous person walking with God. And very specifically says the things they do not do. So in Psalm 1, starting verse 1 there, I just want to read the first 3 verses. Again, it's been read for us, but he says, Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. Doesn't that sound a lot like Job when he says, I kept all his commandments? How do you keep them all if you don't think about them? And that's what this psalm talks about. And then in verse 3 it says, He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yield its fruit in its season, its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. Let me ask you the difference, just a moment, before I'm going to come back to something. What is the difference between a wild tree, like you can go down by the river, Boise River, almost any place along from Boise all the way out, to Eagle and Canyon County even. And you see all the trees just growing up along the side. Now, you remember a couple years ago now, when we had Snowmageddon here, like the Midwest is getting now, the river rose. We couldn't even, in Boise, we couldn't float the river at all that summer because it was running so much, it was so high. What happened to a lot of the trees? Ripped them out. Why? They just grew there wildly, didn't they? Somebody didn't go and plant them there. Would you have planted a tree there if you wanted to plant one and grow all its fruit? No, you might have made it nearby, but you would have put it in a place of protection. I want you to understand something about what he is telling us here, because it actually is reiterated a number of places, that God actually plants us, and he cultivates us. He puts us in good soil. And then he does everything to trim our branches and cut away the dead branches and the dead leaves that we might grow. And that's exactly what he was promising here to the righteous man. And so I want you to talk about these three things, though, he mentions at the beginning. That he didn't walk, with the wicked or their counsel. So think about what he's saying. To walk means to practice something, to do it. And that means you heard the wicked give you advice. Now, you've probably gotten a lot of advice in your lifetime. Some of it good, some of it not good. Now, not all of the good advice, or to say that you don't always get good advice even from wise people. Sometimes people give bad advice. Sometimes they don't fully understand the situation, don't fully understand your issue, and the advice they give doesn't really fit. It's not very good advice. But that's not kind of what he's talking about. It's like, sometimes you don't get good advice. He's talking about actually getting advice by people who are practicing wickedness and telling you how to do it too. And he says, you're blessed if you don't listen and practice the things that wicked people tell you to do. Well, you should do this, so it's good. It's fun. You'll enjoy it. It won't hurt you. Everybody does it. Well, that's true. And this is where, your parents say, remember what your parents tell you? Well, if everybody was jumping off the bridge, are you jumping too? It doesn't matter if everybody's doing something stupid. It's still stupid. It doesn't matter if everybody's doing something that's harmful. It's still harmful. Everybody wants to be rebellious. And you know what the irony is? The real rebel is the person who practices righteousness. Because everybody else rebels. You really want to be a rebel, even as a youth? Don't do what all the people do. Don't do what everybody says. Because all they are is lemmings, walking and following, leading themselves off the cliff. All in the name of being rebellious. Human beings have kind of that innate nature to them oftentimes of wanting to kind of rebel. You're told not to do something, and often you want to do it even more. And we're all exactly the same. We're not really rebels. We're just human beings. And so you don't do the things that people who are practicing wickedness tell you to do. The second thing he says is don't stand in the way of sinners. Now, the way means that path. Here's sinners practicing something. And what do you think is, just think about the imagery. If you're standing, people walking on the path. What are you doing when you're standing there watching people walk on a way? You're observing, aren't you? So you're watching them. And he says, you're going to be a lot more blessed if you don't sit and watch them. Do that. Walk away. And then the last one he says, and sits in the seat of scoffers. So scoffing is essentially a word for mocking. Because what happens when you're young in school and people are enticing you, oh, let's do this, and you say no? Are they just going to go, oh, yeah, that's your choice? No, that's not how they do that. They are going to bully you or mock you as being in goody two-shoes or some other kind of language that probably isn't so nice, and they're going to ostracize you. They're going to make fun of you. They're going to scoff at you. So what do you often do? Because you don't want people doing that to you, right? Because what happens, even sometimes, as far as going back to elementary school, I can remember it in kindergarten. Groups picking on another kid. And somebody not wanting to be that kid. You don't want to be the kid being picked on, so what do? You join them and you pick on the other kid. I don't know how many people could honestly, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I don't know how many people can honestly say they were never the person who joined in and ridiculed or scoffed another, so that didn't happen to them. Because that happens to most. And that's kind of what he's talking about. That you didn't sit with them and scoff at others too. You didn't sit with them and join them. It's easy to do because it is, human beings we were not made to be isolated. We are a pack mammal. We are not individual. We're not like, tigers roaming around in the jungle. You think about all the animals that we're often called sheep and goats or wolves. They always have in common pack animals. And human beings are that. And so it's hurtful to be ostracized and cast away from the group. And so we often fall into the trap that we end up either listening to them, watching them, or joining them in that ungodliness. And he's saying, don't do that. Don't be that. Be the tree planted by God that yields its fruit in its season. Because the fruit of the sinner, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit, it feels good in the moment, it hurts in the end. And then, but the tree planted by waters, sometimes it hurts in the moment to be that tree. But it yields a fruit of blessing. And that's what he's urging from us. To try and think beyond the moment. To try and see beyond the situation we are immediately in and think about what is to come. Can I choose the hard way? You ever remember that story? In movies, the bad guys always tell people when before they're trying to get information from you, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Does anybody ever choose, let's do the hard way. I like the hard way better. Right? No, people don't naturally choose the hard way, do we? But I want you to understand that's exactly what you are being called to do by God, is to choose the hard way. Because the hard way has a greater return on your life. It has a greater blessing to the end of your life. And so, I want you to look over here at this passage in Matthew 15. And I'm going to highlight, I'm not going to read all of it, but I just want to highlight all of, I want you to see the context of really a specific verse here. So starting in verse 1, Jesus is talking to, Israel, and the Pharisees and the scribes, they came to Jesus from Jerusalem, and they're telling them, why are you guys breaking the traditions? They weren't washing their hands before they ate. By the way, that wasn't the mom's old tradition, make sure you wash your hands before you eat. That wasn't that kind of washing. The kind of washing they were talking about was a ceremonial washing, of having taken certain waters, put them on your hand, let them drip off. It wasn't for cleaning germs. I'm not sure how they understood germs, viruses, bacteria and things like that. But that's not the kind of washing they're talking about. They're talking about purification ritual. And wasn't commanded in the law, but it had developed under Judaism as something that they were told to do, a ritual practice of most Jews. And so they're asking, why are you doing this? You're breaking these traditions. And notice they didn't say, they weren't breaking the law. They weren't breaking the commandments. They were breaking their tradition. But they held their traditions to be very sacred from their forefathers. And so he asked them, as Jesus often did when he responded, because he responded so clearly, right? No, he would respond, when asked a question, he often gave a question back. He says, why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? Can you imagine? Very often when we ask people questions and they give us a question back, we don't I wasn't ready for that. And he says, and he tells them, God commanded honor your father and your mother. Now, I bet most of them thought they were doing it. But they had a tradition, he goes on to describe, where they could take some of their wealth and they could dedicate it to God. It's called Korban. I always wondered why Corbin University calls themselves that, or that term. It seemed weird to me, first time I ever heard it. But they would use, so it was dedicated to God. I assume that's what the word means. But it's they did that, and they would dedicate things to God. That doesn't mean they gave it away. That means they kept it and dedicated it to God. Until mom and dad needed help. Oh, yeah, but I can't use that. Dedicated it to God. That's what they were doing. And he would say, they broke the commandment to honor your father and mother, which means pay them money when they need it, by the way. Because honor is not just respect. It actually has two meanings, even in their time. Even in our time, it does as well. It means not only to respect and to give a certain amount of respect, but it also means to support financially. And so they weren't doing that. And that's what he told them. And he said, well, did Isaiah prophesy about you? This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Now, he went on, he called the people to him and said to them, so now these people had kind of accused him of something, and he kind of accused them back. And then, by the way, he didn't say he didn't do that. He simply said, you guys are violating the law. I'm violating your traditions, you're violating the law of God. And so he called all the rest of the people to him. He says, listen, hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person. Now, why do you say that? It goes back to specifically what they were doing, purifying their hands so that they didn't defile themselves. And he says, you guys are missing the point. That is not how you get defiled. And we should understand it. We want to wash our hands when it comes, flu season, and don't get sick and all that stuff. And I'm, as I get older and older and hate getting sick more and more, I'm a little more OCD about it. About touch. Oh, I touched somebody. Watch this. I feel myself thinking about viruses and bugs and bacteria a lot more than I used to. But that's not what he's talking about, because that doesn't defile us either. What defiles us is sin. Those things aren't sin. Getting sick isn't sin. And so he was telling them, listen, that's not. And so the disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? Apparently, modern day is not the only generation of people that get offended. He says, he's like, oh, they were really offended by what you said. And he answered, oh, I'm just so sorry. I'm so sorry I offended somebody. No, he said, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. He says, don't worry about them. They're not planted by God. They're going to be torn out anyway. And that comes back to the idea of being planted by God. We need God on our side that plants us by the still waters. And that's what he's talking about, walking with God. Walking with God is being that tree that has been planted by the river of life, that is guided and instructed by the words and the commandments of God, even when it's hard. Because I don't know, have you found that the commandments of God are easy to practice? I have found that some commandments are sometimes easy to practice. But when it really comes down to it, following a command is about doing it when it's hard, not when it's easy. So we're commanded to love our neighbor. When your neighbor is somebody you love and they love you back and you have great affection and kindness and care, it's like, oh, this is so easy and it's wonderful. But when your neighbor's a complete jerk, and beyond that, hates your guts, and says vile things to you, does awful things to you, do you pray for them? See, that's hard. Do you love them and do you speak kindly of them? That's hard. But it's good for you. I noticed something at my mom's funeral this week. On Monday, on Monday, we had a viewing. And there was an interesting name, the very first person who came in and wrote their name down. I was a little surprised they wrote their name down. When I was a little kid, actually we had a couple of neighbors from when I was really like a baby. Neighbors we grew up with for a long time in a neighborhood came and visited. Some of them were 95 years old. But one of the names, maybe my brothers even saw it. They saw it before me because I couldn't quite picture the name. I knew the name, but then my brothers saw it, but they actually left to make sure they didn't run into her. It was a lady who must have also been about 90 years old, who had actually committed adultery against my mom with my dad. And so my brothers, the pain they still felt. They were like, I can't believe you. They were all angry and upset. And the pain from that moment, and I remember talking to my brothers about it, that, why? Try to think for yourself. Why would a woman who was my mom's best friend have showed up, at her funeral, probably from that point, 55 years later, 50 years later? Why would she have paid her respects at my mom's funeral? I said, don't you think she probably was sitting there apologizing to her friend because of the guilt that has racked her? But the problem is not what she did or what happened to my mother. It's how my brothers still felt. That was the real problem. They still were affected by that pain because they couldn't forgive. They're still held hostage and in bondage from that sin that was committed so long ago by others. And so it didn't set them free. They're not free. They're not released from the pain. They don't have kindness and forgiveness with them and walking with them. So that fruit, it wasn't there. And so you talk about doing things the hard way, forgiving people that, boy, sometimes don't seem like they deserve it. But it's worth it. And so, because I really noticed how how very different it affected them versus me. And it was, but that's the difference between the fruit of the Spirit and the fruit of the world. Right? The fruit of wickedness, that often, the fruit of the flesh. That's what comes up when we still harbor those things, when we can't love people who don't love us back, when we can't be kind to people who don't treat us well. It doesn't hurt them, it hurts us. And we want that, what God talks about, the fruit of righteousness being planted by the river of life. We've got to choose the hard way. Now, I just kind of quickly mention, though, Psalm 1, 4 through 6 does also refer to the easy way, which doesn't end so well. And that is, the wicked are not so, but they're like chaff that the wind drives away. And therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So they become like that dried up outside part of wheat. You know, that almost like the outside part of an onion. It's that flaky stuff. The wind just kind of blows it away. Because that's what happens when you walk in wickedness. That's what happens when you're consumed and your life is overcome by sin and the evil of it. That we dry up and become nothing. And eventually we perish and are destroyed from God. And so the question really comes back to the idea of which path we will choose. Because this is I don't know if this is an irony, this is the thing that most people don't understand. There really are only two paths in the world. One path is really wide, and it's easy to walk down. And you can do almost anything you want on that path. Now, people on that path still judge one another. No, I'm better than you. No, I'm better than you. My sin's not as bad as your sin. You can do anything you want. All you have to do is focus on yourself, and you can walk through that wide gate down that easy path. The problem with that path, which most of the world takes, most of us have been on it. If you're old enough, we've all been on it at one point in our life. But I'm not going to go over the Matthew 7:13. 13 and 14 Jesus talked about the wide gate and the easy way versus the narrow gate and the difficult way or the hard way. But what happens is all we have to do is set our mind on earthly things. All we have to do is focus on here and now and trying to be happy and trying to... If our mind gets so consumed with living life on the earth that we don't think about anything else, we can easily walk down that path. And we can do it proclaiming to be righteous. Lots of people do. I'm not going to read all these passages for time this morning. But also James 4:4 talks about being friends with the world. And he says, become adulterers and adulteresses and enemies of God. See, this path isn't godly. It's human. It's very naturally human. Everybody on it kind of is doing human things. We understand them. Almost everything shown in movies and sung about in music is describing this path. This path is full of the children of disobedience, who disobey, who like to disobey, who don't want anybody telling them what they can or cannot do. Right? And almost every one of us is like that, right? The very best of us, I'll bet you, if we were just out somewhere and I simply just told you to do something, not that I had authority over you or anything, I just said there, we're out doing something, maybe I just told you to do something, what would be your reaction? We all have the same reaction. We don't want to be told what to do. The only time we really listen to somebody tell us what to do is if we, at some point, have accepted, okay, this person actually has some power over me. Has some authority. It's like my boss. My boss is an idiot, but I'm not talking about me. But the mentality that we have sometimes is that we do what people say only when we have to. We don't like to take orders. We don't like to simply follow what other people tell us to do. That is not kind of normal humans. Normal humans don't like being told what to do. That's the easy way. That is actually the easiest path in the world to take, is to just be rebellious. But he tells us that this path leads to destruction. It leads to the kinds of trouble and difficulty that Job, in fact, faced. That's why his friends looked at him and, well, this usually only happens to really bad people. The problem is Job was an exception to that principle. I thought it was funny. Was it last week? I think we made the announcement of locking bathroom doors. And almost everybody probably here kind of knew generally who was. And so I talked with, after Job, who was laughing. And I was thinking about Job. It's like, didn't have evidence. We didn't know for sure. Even the father was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I know who it is. Now, he was right. It was. But is there one chance out of 100 it might not have been? It's possible. That's actually Job's situation. What happened to Job is often what happens to people who walk in darkness and wickedness. That life collapses. We build things, but it's a facade. It's not real. And it collapses around us. The other path is a difficult gate to get through. And it's a hard path to walk. That's what Jesus said there in Matthew 7 and 13 and 14. He's urging us to take the narrow gate and the hard way. But our mind needs to be set on things that are above. God's love, God's grace, God's salvation, so that we can look at other people, even somebody who has hurt me, and say, I wonder if they have been saved. I wonder if they have the grace of God. And have that mean more to me than whether or not that person has been good to me. They're called friends of God. God says, these people, these are my friends. Those who choose the hard way are his friends, and they are his children. And I want you to understand, I use the word choose very specifically because you're not born on these paths. You are born human, and you ultimately have the choice between two paths in life. Your way, the easy way, or God's way, the hard way. One ends at a not so great location, and the other ends in paradise. That's our decision to make. That's our choice that we ultimately have to make. Which path are we going to make? Job made his, and no matter all the difficulties and trials and terrible things that happened to him, he said, I'm not giving it up. This is how I walk. This is how I'm going to live. I choose the hard way.